Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into one of history's most famous lives, and quietly discovering that it might have been far less glamorous than the movies promised. Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, the woman who supposedly seduced emperors, bathed in milk, and somehow had perfect lighting at all times. But here's the strange part. Almost everything we think we know about Cleopatra was written by her enemies, which is a bit like letting your ex write your biography and then wondering why you come across as dramatic, manipulative, and suspiciously fond of chaos. So tonight we're going to slow things down and gently peel back the layers, not the dramatic version with golden crowns and cinematic entrances, but the quieter, more complicated reality behind the last Queen of Egypt. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this kind of calm, slightly suspicious journey through history, and if you feel like it, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. It's always fascinating to imagine these stories drifting quietly across the world at different hours of the night. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan or some soft background noise, get comfortable, and let your shoulders drop just a little, because tonight raises a few questions. What was Cleopatra actually like when no one was watching? Was she really the most beautiful woman in the world, or just very, very good at politics? Did she spend her days in luxury, or quietly managing a collapsing kingdom? And perhaps most importantly, what exactly was she trying to hide? Now, let's take a closer look, because tonight we aren't meeting the legend. We're meeting the person behind it, and slowly, quietly, the truth she may not have wanted remembered. At this point, Cleopatra's story does not begin with power, but with instability. She was born into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a ruling family that had governed Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, yet never quite belonged to it. They were Macedonian Greeks, descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals, and they ruled from Alexandria with a careful distance from the land they claimed as their own. This distance was not only cultural, but emotional. The dynasty itself had become known less for unity and more for quiet internal conflict. What made this more complicated was that the Ptolemaic court had a habit of turning family into rivals. Brothers married sisters, not out of affection, but to preserve royal bloodlines. These arrangements, though presented as tradition, often created tension rather than stability. Power was shared in name, but rarely in practice. It was not uncommon for siblings to compete, undermine one another, or quietly disappear from the political stage altogether. Cleopatra grew up in this environment, surrounded by ceremony on the surface and uncertainty beneath it. The palace would have been filled with tutors, servants, and advisors, each performing their role with careful precision. Yet behind the structured routines, there was always an awareness that alliances could shift without warning. A trusted advisor one day might be absent the next, replaced without explanation. The atmosphere itself carried a certain weight. The sound of footsteps echoing through polished halls, the soft murmur of conversations just out of reach, the constant presence of guards stationed at doorways. These were not just details of royal life, but quiet reminders that power required protection, even from those closest to you. Historically, Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, had already struggled to maintain control. His rule depended heavily on Roman support, which meant that Egypt's independence was, in many ways, already compromised before Cleopatra ever came close to the throne. This reliance on Rome would become one of the defining challenges of her life, though at the time it may have simply felt like a distant and persistent pressure. As a child, Cleopatra would not have been shielded from these realities. Royal children in the Ptolemaic court were raised not only to observe but to understand. She likely learned early that survival required more than intelligence. It required patience, awareness, and the ability to read the intentions of others without being obvious about it. There is also a quiet irony here. While history often remembers Cleopatra as a powerful and commanding figure, her early years were shaped by a lack of control. She was born into a system already in decline, where authority was fragile and often dependent on forces beyond Egypt's borders. And yet, within this fragile environment, something else was forming. Cleopatra was not simply observing the world around her. She was learning from it. Every conversation, every shift in loyalty, every carefully measured decision made by those in power contributed to her understanding of how authority truly worked. The expectation might have been that she would follow the same patterns as those before her, repeating the cycle of rivalry and instability. But there are subtle signs, even at this early stage, that she was beginning to think differently. Where others saw tradition, she may have seen limitation. Where others relied on inherited power, she seemed to recognize the importance of adaptability. But this was only the beginning of her story. The fractured dynasty into which she was born would shape her instincts, her decisions, and perhaps even the secrets she would later try to control. For now, she remained a young member of a royal family, quietly absorbing the lessons of a world where trust was rare and power was never guaranteed. And in that quiet, watchful beginning, the foundations of her future were already being set. But this was only part of the story. The palace itself, where Cleopatra spent her early years, was not simply a place of residence. It was a carefully controlled environment where every interaction carried meaning and every relationship was shaped by necessity rather than comfort. The royal palace in Alexandria stood as a symbol of wealth and authority, overlooking the Mediterranean with quiet confidence. Its architecture reflected the influence of both Greek and Egyptian traditions, blending marble columns with intricate decorative details. To an outsider, it might have appeared as a place of beauty and refinement, but within its walls the atmosphere was far more complex. What made this environment particularly delicate was the constant presence of observation. Servants moved quietly through corridors, often unnoticed, but always present. Advisors lingered near doorways, ready to offer guidance or gather information. Guards stood at attention, their role extending beyond protection to quiet surveillance. In such a setting, privacy was not something easily found. The sounds of the palace were subtle but persistent. The soft rustle of fabric as officials passed by, the distant echo of conversations carried through open spaces, the occasional clink of metal from a guard adjusting his stance. These small details created a sense of constant activity, yet rarely did anything feel entirely relaxed. Cleopatra would have grown accustomed to this rhythm, learning to navigate it with care. Conversations were rarely direct. Meaning was often implied rather than spoken openly. A simple exchange of words could carry multiple layers, depending on who was listening and what they might gain from it. Historically, the Ptolemaic court was known for its intrigue. Decisions were influenced not only by logic but by loyalty, ambition, and sometimes fear. Advisors competed for influence, each attempting to position themselves closer to power. In such a setting, trust was not given freely. It had to be earned carefully, and even then, it could not always be relied upon. For Cleopatra, this meant that relationships were shaped by caution. Friendships, if they existed, were likely limited by the understanding that alliances could change. Even within her own family, closeness was uncertain. The expectation of shared rule often created tension rather than unity, reinforcing the idea that proximity to power came with risk. There is a quiet contrast here between appearance and reality. The palace projected an image of order and stability, yet beneath that surface there was constant movement, decisions being made, strategies being adjusted, loyalties being tested. It was a world where stillness was often an illusion. As Cleopatra moved through this environment, she would have developed a heightened awareness of these dynamics. She learned not only to listen, but to interpret. A pause in conversation, a shift in tone, a glance exchanged between two advisors. These small details could reveal far more than words themselves. This ability to observe without drawing attention became one of her most valuable skills. It allowed her to understand the structure of power from within, to see how decisions were influenced, and how authority could be maintained or lost. At the same time, this environment likely shaped her sense of caution. In a place where trust was uncertain, reliance on others had to be measured. Independence, even in small ways, became essential. But despite this careful balance, the palace could not fully contain the tensions that surrounded it. The conflicts within the dynasty, the pressures from Rome, and the ambitions of those within the court were all quietly building. And as Cleopatra continued to grow within this world, she was not simply adapting to it. She was preparing, perhaps without fully realizing it, for the moment when she would need to step beyond observation and begin shaping events herself. For now, however, she remained within the palace, watching, learning, and understanding that in this place, trust was not a given, but a risk. At this point, something begins to quietly distinguish Cleopatra from those who came before her. While many members of the Ptolemaic dynasty maintained a distance from Egyptian culture, Cleopatra made a deliberate effort to engage with it more directly. What made this more significant was the simple but meaningful choice to learn the Egyptian language. For generations, the rulers of Egypt under the Ptolemaic dynasty had relied on Greek, both in governance and daily life. Egyptian, though widely spoken by the population, was often left outside the inner workings of the court. Cleopatra's decision to learn it suggests a different perspective. It was not merely an academic exercise, but a practical step toward connection. By speaking the language of the people she ruled, she reduced the distance that had long existed between the monarchy and its subjects. The process of learning itself would have been quiet and methodical, tutors guiding her through pronunciation, scripts laid out carefully, repeated phrases practiced until they became natural. The sounds of the language, distinct from Greek, would have carried a different rhythm, one that connected her more closely to the land she governed. This shift in approach reflects a broader understanding of power. Authority was not only maintained through force or tradition, but through perception and relationship. By presenting herself as a ruler who could communicate directly with her people, Cleopatra strengthened her position in ways that were subtle but effective. Historically, this choice set her apart. Ancient sources suggest that Cleopatra may have been the first of her dynasty to fully embrace the Egyptian language. While her predecessors relied on translators and intermediaries, she chose direct engagement. There is a quiet intelligence in this. Language is more than communication. It is a form of access. It allows for nuance, for understanding beyond surface-level interaction. By speaking Egyptian, Cleopatra could hear concerns, interpret tone, and respond without the filter of another person's interpretation. At the same time, she did not abandon her Greek heritage. Instead, she expanded her capabilities, reportedly learning multiple languages. This adaptability allowed her to move between different cultural and political spaces with ease, adjusting her approach depending on the situation. The environment in which she practiced these skills would have been calm, almost routine. The soft scratch of writing tools on papyrus, the measured voice of a tutor correcting a phrase, the repetition of words until they became familiar. These moments, though small, contributed to a larger transformation. What makes this particularly interesting is how it contrasts with the expectations placed upon her. The Ptolemaic dynasty had long maintained a sense of separation from Egyptian identity. Cleopatra's choice to bridge that gap suggests a willingness to challenge established norms, even in subtle ways. But this was not simply about cultural interest. It was about positioning. By aligning herself more closely with Egypt, she reinforced her legitimacy as its ruler. In a time when her authority would later be questioned, this connection would prove valuable. There is also an element of foresight here. Cleopatra seemed to recognize that power was not static. It required adjustment, awareness, and sometimes a departure from tradition. Her approach to language reflects this understanding. And yet, even as she developed these skills, the challenges surrounding her continued to grow. The palace remained a place of tension, the dynasty still fragile, and Rome's influence ever present. Her ability to communicate, to adapt, and to understand different perspectives would soon become essential. But for now, these skills were being shaped quietly, in moments that may have seemed ordinary at the time. In learning the language of her people, Cleopatra was also learning something else: how to navigate a world where power depended not only on authority, but on connection. And this quiet shift would follow her into every decision she made thereafter. But even as Cleopatra developed these abilities, the outward image of her life remained carefully controlled. From a distance, her world appeared defined by comfort, elegance, and effortless authority. Yet this image was in many ways a constructed illusion. The palace itself provided the setting for this illusion. Large open courtyards filled with sunlight, polished stone floors reflecting movement, and carefully arranged decorations designed to impress visitors. Every detail contributed to an atmosphere of wealth and refinement. Clothing played a role as well. Fine fabrics, intricate jewellery, and carefully styled appearances were not simply expressions of personal taste, but tools of presentation. Each choice conveyed status, reinforcing the perception of control and stability. The sensory experience of this environment was deliberate. The faint scent of incense drifting through halls, the soft sound of water from decorative fountains, the muted voices of attendants moving quietly in the background. These elements created a sense of calm, even when underlying tensions remained unresolved. What made this more complex was the purpose behind it. Royal luxury was not only about comfort, but about communication. It signalled authority to those within the court and to visitors from beyond Egypt. It suggested that the kingdom was stable, even when it was not. Historically, rulers often relied on such displays to maintain influence. Cleopatra was no exception. Her appearances, her surroundings, and even the pacing of her public life were likely shaped with intention. Nothing was entirely accidental. Yet beneath this carefully maintained image, the reality was far less certain. The political situation remained fragile, and the pressures from both within the dynasty and from Rome continued to grow. Luxury, in this context, functioned almost as a layer placed over instability. There is a quiet contrast here between what was seen and what was experienced. To an observer, Cleopatra's life might have appeared effortless, but maintaining that image required constant attention. Every detail had to align with the narrative she wished to present. This required a different kind of effort, one that was less visible but equally demanding. It involved planning, awareness, and the ability to anticipate how actions would be interpreted. Even moments of rest were likely influenced by the need to maintain composure. The palace, for all its beauty, was also a place of expectation. Those within it were expected to perform their roles consistently. Deviations from this performance could create uncertainty, something the court could not afford. Cleopatra's ability to navigate this environment suggests a level of discipline that is often overlooked. She understood that perception could shape reality, and she used that understanding to reinforce her position. But this reliance on appearance also had its limitations. While it could influence how she was viewed, it could not fully control the events unfolding around her. The challenges she faced required more than presentation. And as the balance of power within her family began to shift, the illusion of stability would become increasingly difficult to maintain. For now, however, the image remained intact, a queen surrounded by luxury, moving through a world that appeared calm, even as it quietly prepared to change. What made Cleopatra's position even more uncertain was the structure of her rule. She did not inherit the throne as a sole ruler, but as part of a shared arrangement with her brother, following the long-standing traditions of the Ptolemaic dynasty. At first glance, this system may have appeared balanced. Two rulers, bound by both family and obligation, governing together. In theory, it offered continuity and stability. In practice, it often created tension. Shared rule required cooperation, yet the structure itself encouraged competition. Authority was divided, but ambition was not. Each ruler carried their own interests, their own advisors, and their own vision of control. The environment within the palace reflected this delicate balance. Conversations became more measured, decisions more carefully negotiated. Even routine matters could carry underlying significance, as each action contributed to the shifting dynamics of power. Cleopatra, still relatively young, found herself navigating this arrangement with increasing awareness. Her brother, influenced by his own circle of advisors, represented not only a partner in rule, but a potential rival. Historically, such arrangements rarely ended peacefully. The Ptolemaic dynasty had a long history of internal conflict, and the expectation of shared authority often led to division rather than unity. The sensory atmosphere of this period would have been marked by subtle tension. The quiet exchange of information between advisors, the careful observation of each other's actions, the awareness that even small decisions could have larger implications. Cleopatra's approach during this time appears to have been one of cautious engagement. She participated in the structure of shared rule while gradually establishing her own presence. Her earlier efforts to connect with the Egyptian people, to understand the dynamics of power, began to take on greater importance. At the same time, the influence of Rome remained a constant factor. The Ptolemaic dynasty's reliance on Roman support meant that internal conflicts could quickly attract external attention. This added another layer of complexity to an already fragile arrangement. What made this situation particularly challenging was the lack of clear boundaries. Authority was shared, but not equally defined. Decisions required negotiation, yet there was always the possibility that one side might attempt to consolidate control. Cleopatra's ability to navigate this environment suggests a growing confidence in her own judgment. She was no longer simply observing the structures around her, but actively participating in them. However, the balance could not be maintained indefinitely. The tensions inherent in shared rule were already beginning to surface, and the stability of the arrangement was becoming increasingly uncertain. There is a quiet inevitability here. The structure itself made conflict likely, even if it was not immediately visible. The combination of ambition, influence, and external pressure created conditions that would eventually lead to a shift. And as this shift approached, Cleopatra would find herself facing a decision, whether to adapt to the structure as it was, or to challenge it entirely? For now, the throne remained shared, but beneath that shared authority, the sense of safety it was meant to provide was already beginning to fade. But this was only the moment when the fragile balance finally gave way. Cleopatra's position, once carefully maintained within the palace, began to unravel, not with a single dramatic event, but through a gradual shift that became impossible to ignore. At this point, the shared rule between Cleopatra and her brother had grown increasingly unstable. Advisors, particularly those surrounding her brother, began to consolidate influence. Decisions were made without her input, and the tone of the court subtly changed. What had once been a tense partnership was becoming something more one-sided. The transition itself was not loud. There were no immediate declarations, no public confrontations. Instead, Cleopatra found herself quietly pushed aside. Access to the palace diminished. Support within the court weakened. The routine she had known began to dissolve, replaced by uncertainty. Exile, when it came, was not announced with ceremony. It was more of an absence, a realization that she could no longer remain where she'd once belonged. She left Alexandria not as a defeated figure in chains, but as someone who understood that staying would be far more dangerous than leaving. The environment beyond the palace was markedly different. The controlled calm of marble halls gave way to the open, shifting landscape of Egypt's outskirts. The air felt less contained, carrying the scent of dust and distant water rather than incense. Movement was no longer guided by protocol but by necessity. Historically, Cleopatra retreated eastward, likely towards Syria, where she began to gather support. This was not a passive withdrawal. Even in exile, she remained active, building alliances and preparing for a return. The quiet nature of her departure masked a continued engagement with power. What made this period particularly significant was the shift in perspective it required. Within the palace, Cleopatra had operated within an established system. Outside of it, she had to rely more directly on her own judgment. Decisions became immediate, shaped by changing conditions rather than structured routines. There is a subtle contrast here between loss and opportunity. Exile removed her from the centre of power, but it also freed her from the constraints of the court. Without the constant observation of rivals, she could act with greater independence, though not without risk. The sounds of this period would have been different as well. The distant movement of troops, the murmur of negotiations held in quieter, less formal settings, the occasional stillness of waiting. It was a slower rhythm, but one that required careful attention. Cleopatra's ability to navigate this shift suggests resilience. Rather than retreating entirely, she adapted. She began to operate beyond the palace's structured environment, learning to manage uncertainty in a more direct way. But exile also carried a quiet weight. It was a reminder that power could be taken as easily as it was given. The position she had once held was no longer secure, and the path back to it was uncertain. And yet, even in this uncertainty, Cleopatra did not remain still. The foundations she had built earlier, her awareness, her adaptability, her understanding of people, began to take on greater significance. This period, though often overlooked, marked a transition. She was no longer simply a participant in the palace's internal dynamics. She was now an active player in a broader and more unpredictable landscape. And as she prepared for what would come next, the quiet beginning of exile became something else entirely, a preparation for return. At the same time that Cleopatra adjusted to life outside Alexandria, another presence continued to shape events from a distance. Rome, already deeply involved in Egypt's affairs, was watching closely. What made this more complicated was that Rome's interest in Egypt was not new. For years, the Republic had maintained influence over the Ptolemaic dynasty, often supporting rulers who aligned with its interests. Cleopatra's father had relied heavily on Roman backing, setting a precedent that could not easily be undone. From Rome's perspective, Egypt represented both wealth and strategic importance. Its grain supply was vital, its location significant. Stability in Egypt was not simply a regional concern, it was a matter of broader importance. The atmosphere in Rome during this period was itself uncertain. Political tensions within the Republic were growing, with rival leaders competing for influence. Decisions regarding foreign territories were often influenced by internal dynamics, making outcomes less predictable. Cleopatra's situation, though geographically distant, was not isolated from these developments. Her exile and the internal conflict within Egypt would have been observed, discussed, and interpreted through the lens of Roman interests. There is a quiet distance in this relationship. Rome did not intervene immediately, nor did it ignore the situation entirely. Instead, it maintained a position of watchful awareness, ready to act when necessary. The flow of information between Egypt and Rome would have been steady but measured. Messengers carrying reports, letters outlining developments, advisors interpreting events. Each piece of information contributed to a broader understanding of the situation. For Cleopatra, this external presence added another layer of complexity. Her return to power would not depend solely on internal support. It would also be influenced by how Rome chose to respond. The sensory details of this period remain subdued. The quiet exchange of messages, the careful consideration of alliances, the distant but constant awareness of Rome's influence. It was a presence felt more through implication than direct action. Historically, this dynamic reflects the broader relationship between Rome and its neighbouring regions. Influence was often exerted indirectly, through support, recognition, or pressure, rather than immediate control. Cleopatra's awareness of this would have shaped her approach. She understood that Rome could not be ignored, but also that its involvement could not be assumed. Navigating this uncertainty required patience. There is a sense of waiting here, not inactivity, but a pause in which multiple possibilities remained open. Cleopatra was preparing for her next move, while Rome observed, considering its own interests. This quiet tension between action and observation created a space in which decisions could shift quickly. A single event, a change in leadership, or a new opportunity could alter the course of events. And as Cleopatra remained in exile, building her position, Rome's distant gaze remained fixed on Egypt, watching, assessing, and waiting for the moment when involvement would become unavoidable. What made the situation more immediate was the arrival of Julius Caesar. His presence in Egypt was not accidental, but the result of broader events unfolding within Rome itself. At this point, Caesar had emerged as one of the most powerful figures in the Roman Republic. His military campaigns had brought him both success and opposition, leading to a civil war that extended beyond Rome's borders. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria, he entered a kingdom already in conflict. Cleopatra's exile and the internal struggle for power had created a situation that required resolution, though not necessarily in a straightforward way. The setting of Alexandria during his arrival would have been both familiar and tense. The city remained a centre of culture and learning, its streets active and its harbour busy. Yet beneath this activity was a sense of uncertainty, as the political situation remained unresolved. Cleopatra, aware of Caesar's influence, recognized the significance of his presence. His support could alter the balance of power, but it also came with expectations. Engaging with him required careful consideration. The interaction between Cleopatra and Caesar is often presented as a moment of immediate connection. In reality, it was likely more measured. Cleopatra needed to present herself in a way that would secure his interest and support without appearing dependent. There is a quiet calculation in this approach. Cleopatra's earlier experiences, her time in the palace, her exile, her understanding of power, would have informed her actions. She was not entering this interaction unprepared. The atmosphere surrounding their meeting would have been controlled, yet charged with significance. The soft movement of attendants, the careful arrangement of space, the awareness that this moment carried weight beyond the immediate conversation. Historically, Caesar's involvement in Egypt was driven by both political and practical concerns. Resolving the conflict between Cleopatra and her brother aligned with his interests, but it also required him to navigate a foreign court with its own dynamics. Cleopatra's ability to engage with him effectively suggests a level of confidence. She understood the importance of the moment and approached it with intention rather than uncertainty. The sensory details remain subtle. The quiet exchange of words, the measured tone of conversation, the stillness that often accompanies important decisions. It was not a dramatic encounter, but a significant one. This meeting marked a turning point. Cleopatra was no longer operating solely within the constraints of her exile. She was now engaging directly with one of the most powerful figures in the known world. And as their interaction unfolded, the balance of power within Egypt began to shift once again, setting the stage for what would follow. But this moment, often retold with dramatic embellishment, deserves a quieter examination. The story of Cleopatra's introduction to Caesar has become one of the most famous in history, yet its reality may have been far more practical than legend suggests. The commonly repeated image, Cleopatra being delivered to Caesar wrapped in a carpet, captures attention, but it also simplifies the situation. While such a method of entry may have occurred in some form, its purpose was likely strategic rather than theatrical. At this point, Cleopatra needed access. Alexandria was under control of her brother's supporters, and reaching Caesar directly required discretion. A concealed entrance, whether in a carpet or a similar object, would have allowed her to bypass obstacles without drawing attention. The setting itself would have been controlled. Caesar, occupying a position of authority within the palace, would have been surrounded by his own advisors and guards. Cleopatra's arrival, though unexpected, would have been managed within this structured environment. What made this interaction significant was not the method of entry, but what followed. Cleopatra needed to present her case clearly, demonstrating both her legitimacy and her value as an ally. Her approach would have been measured. Rather than relying on spectacle, she likely focused on communication, explaining her position, outlining the situation, and offering a perspective that aligned with Caesar's interests. There is a quiet confidence implied in this. Cleopatra was not merely seeking assistance, she was negotiating. She understood that Caesar's support would come with expectations, and she needed to position herself accordingly. The sensory details of this moment remain understated. The soft movement of fabric, the quiet presence of guards, the controlled tone of conversation. It was a setting defined by awareness rather than excess. Historically, Caesar's decision to support Cleopatra was influenced by multiple factors. Her claim to the throne, the instability within Egypt, and the broader implications for Rome all played a role. Cleopatra's ability to engage with him effectively contributed to this outcome. Her earlier preparation, her understanding of language, power, and perception allowed her to navigate this interaction with precision. There is also an element of reinterpretation here. The dramatic version of events shaped by later retellings emphasizes spectacle. The The quieter version emphasizes strategy. Both narratives serve different purposes, but the latter aligns more closely with the patterns observed throughout Cleopatra's life. Her actions, though sometimes presented as dramatic, were often grounded in careful consideration. This moment, therefore, becomes less about the image of a queen arriving in secrecy, and more about the interaction that followed. It was a conversation that altered the course of her life and the future of Egypt. And as that conversation concluded, the outcome began to take shape, a shift in power that would soon bring Cleopatra back to the center of events. With Caesar's support, Cleopatra's return to power became possible. The process itself was not immediate, but it marked a clear change in her position. At this point, the conflict within Egypt moved toward resolution. Caesar's involvement provided both authority and enforcement, allowing Cleopatra to reclaim her role as ruler. The shared arrangement with her brother was altered, though not entirely removed. The setting of Alexandria during this transition would have reflected both relief and tension. The city, accustomed to instability, now faced a new configuration of power. While Cleopatra's position was strengthened, it was not entirely independent. What made this more complicated was the nature of her alliance with Caesar. His support came with influence, and that influence extended beyond immediate decisions. Cleopatra's authority was now linked, at least in part, to Roman interests. There is a subtle shift here from restoration to reliance. Cleopatra had regained her throne, but the conditions under which she held it had changed. Independence was now something to be managed rather than assumed. The atmosphere within the palace would have reflected this new reality. Advisors adjusting to the presence of Roman authority, guards maintaining order, and the quiet awareness that the balance of power had shifted. Cleopatra's approach during this period appears to have been one of careful adaptation. She accepted the support she needed while maintaining as much autonomy as possible. This required a balance between cooperation and independence. Historically, this phase of her reign highlights the broader dynamics between Egypt and Rome. The relationship was not one of equal partnership, but of influence and negotiation. The sensory details remain consistent with the earlier tone. The quiet movement within the palace, the measured pace of decisions, the awareness that each action carried significance beyond the immediate moment. Cleopatra's position, though restored, required constant attention. She could not assume stability, as the conditions that had led to her exile remained relevant. Power, once regained, needed to be maintained. There is a quiet understanding here that success does not remove uncertainty. Instead, it often introduces new forms of it. Cleopatra's return to the throne brought with it new responsibilities and new challenges, and as she resumed her role, the broader context continued to evolve. Rome's influence remained present, and the events unfolding beyond Egypt would continue to shape her future. For now, however, Cleopatra stood once again as queen, her authority restored, but her position still requiring careful navigation. And in that balance between power and uncertainty, the next phase of her story quietly began. But this was only part of the story. Cleopatra's return to power did not settle Alexandria into calm stability. Instead, it revealed just how fragile that stability had always been. The city itself, vibrant and intellectually alive, carried beneath its surface a quiet but persistent tension. At this point, Alexandria was one of the most remarkable cities in the Mediterranean. Its streets were filled with merchants, scholars, sailors, and travellers from across the known world. The famous library and the museum stood as symbols of knowledge, attracting thinkers who spent their days in discussion and study. Yet for all its brilliance, Alexandria was also a place where cultures overlapped uneasily. The population was diverse, Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and others, each with their own traditions, loyalties, and expectations. These differences did not always lead to harmony. Instead, they created a layered social structure where misunderstandings and conflicts could emerge quietly, often without immediate resolution. The sensory atmosphere of the city reflected this complexity. The sound of vendors calling out in multiple languages, the distant crash of waves against the harbour, the hum of conversation drifting through crowded marketplaces. It was a place constantly in motion, yet never entirely at ease. What made this more complicated was the political situation. Cleopatra's return, supported by Caesar, had shifted the balance of power. While some welcomed the restoration of order, others viewed it with suspicion. Roman presence within the city, though controlled, was a reminder that Egypt's independence was no longer absolute. Tension could be felt in subtle ways. Conversations that paused when certain names were mentioned, glances exchanged between groups in the streets, the quiet awareness that loyalties were divided. The city functioned, but it did so with an undercurrent of uncertainty. Historically, Alexandria had experienced unrest before, and this period was no exception. The presence of Roman forces, combined with internal divisions, created conditions where conflict could arise quickly. Even small incidents had the potential to escalate. Cleopatra, now back in power, had to navigate this environment carefully. Her role was not only to rule, but to stabilize. This required balancing the interests of different groups while maintaining her own authority. There is a quiet challenge in this. Stability is not simply achieved through control. It requires a constant awareness of shifting dynamics. Cleopatra's earlier experiences, her time in the palace, her exile, her interaction with Caesar, would have informed her approach. She likely moved through the city with a sense of measured observation, aware of both its strengths and its vulnerabilities. The grandeur of Alexandria remained intact, but it required careful management to prevent disruption. At the same time, the presence of Rome continued to shape events. Caesar's influence, though not always visible, was a constant factor. Decisions within Alexandria could not be made in isolation from broader Roman interests. This created a delicate balance. Cleopatra needed to assert her authority while avoiding actions that might provoke unnecessary conflict. It was a position that required patience and precision. The city itself, with all its activity and complexity, became both a stage and a challenge. It reflected the broader situation, vibrant, powerful, but not entirely secure. And as Cleopatra worked to maintain order within Alexandria, the underlying tensions remained, quietly shaping the course of her reign. At this point, Cleopatra's connection with Julius Caesar began to take on a more defined shape. While often described in simple terms, their relationship was far more complex than a story of personal affection. What made this more nuanced was the context in which it developed. Cleopatra needed Caesar's support to secure her position, while Caesar required stability in Egypt to protect Rome's interests. Their interaction, therefore, was built on mutual benefit. The environment in which they spent time together would have been structured yet private. Within the palace, spaces were arranged to allow for discussion without interruption. The presence of attendants, though discreet, ensured that protocol was maintained. The sensory details of these moments were calm. The soft flicker of lamplight, the quiet sound of distant activity within the palace, the measured pace of conversation. These were not scenes of dramatic intensity, but of deliberate exchange. Cleopatra's approach to this relationship appears to have been grounded in awareness. She understood the importance of aligning her interest with Caesar's, presenting herself not only as a ruler, but as a capable partner in maintaining order. Caesar in turn recognized Cleopatra's value. Her knowledge of Egypt, her ability to navigate its complexities, and her willingness to cooperate made her an effective ally. Their connection therefore extended beyond personal interaction into shared objectives. Historically, this period reflects a broader pattern in Cleopatra's life. Her relationships were often shaped by necessity as much as by personal inclination. She operated within a world where alliances were essential, and she used them effectively. There's a quiet contrast here between perception and reality. Later accounts often emphasize the romantic aspect of her connection with Caesar, but this perspective simplifies a relationship that was deeply strategic. The conversations they shared likely focused on practical matters, governance, stability, and the future of Egypt. Personal elements may have been present, but they were intertwined with broader concerns. Cleopatra's ability to maintain this balance suggests a level of composure. She navigated the relationship without losing sight of her own position, ensuring that her authority remained intact. At the same time, the presence of Caesar within Egypt created a visible link between the two. This connection influenced how others perceived her, both within Alexandria and beyond. There is a subtle tension in this. While the relationship strengthened her position, it also tied her more closely to Rome. This association would later shape how her actions were interpreted. The atmosphere of this period remained controlled, yet layered with implication. Each interaction carried significance, each decision contributing to the evolving dynamic between Egypt and Rome. And as Cleopatra and Caesar continued to work together, their relationship became a central element in the story of her reign, one that would influence both her immediate circumstances and her long-term legacy. But this was only part of the unfolding story. The arrival of Cleopatra's son introduced a new dimension to her reign, one that carried both promise and complexity. At this point, the birth of her child, often referred to as caesarean, represented more than a personal event. It had political significance, shaping perceptions of legitimacy and succession. The setting of this moment would have been carefully managed. Within the palace, preparations would have been quiet but deliberate. Attendants moving with purpose, spaces arranged for privacy, the overall atmosphere calm but attentive. The sensory details remained gentle, the soft murmur of voices, the controlled movement of those present, the stillness that often accompanies significant moments. It was an event marked not by spectacle, but by awareness. Cleopatra's role as a mother added a new layer to her identity. It connected her personal life with her political responsibilities, creating a balance that required careful navigation. Historically, the birth of an heir strengthened her position within Egypt. It provided a clear line of succession, reinforcing her legitimacy as ruler. At the same time, it introduced new considerations, particularly in relation to Rome. The identity of the child's father, linked to Caesar, carried implications beyond Egypt's borders. It suggested a connection between the two powers that could be interpreted in different ways. There's a quiet weight to this. The presence of an heir does not simply secure the future, it also shapes expectations. Cleopatra's decisions would now be viewed in relation to her son's position. The environment within the palace likely reflected this shift. Advisors considering the implications, attendants maintaining routine, and Cleopatra herself adjusting to a role that combined leadership with motherhood. Her approach during this period appears to have been measured. She acknowledged the significance of the event while continuing to focus on governance. The responsibilities of ruling did not pause, even as her personal circumstances changed. There is also an element of continuity here. The Ptolemaic dynasty had long emphasized lineage, and the birth of an heir aligned with that tradition. Yet Cleopatra's situation was distinct, shaped by her connection to Rome. The atmosphere remains calm but layered with meaning. Each decision now carried additional significance, influencing not only her reign but the future of her son. And as Cleopatra continued to navigate her responsibilities, the presence of an heir became both a source of strength and a factor requiring careful consideration. What made Cleopatra's position increasingly complex was the steady expansion of Rome's influence. While her authority within Egypt had been restored, it now existed within a broader framework shaped by Roman power. At this point, Rome was not simply an external force. Its presence was integrated into the political landscape of the Mediterranean, affecting decisions across multiple regions. The atmosphere within Alexandria reflected this shift. Roman officials and soldiers, though not always prominent, were part of the city's daily rhythm. Their presence was a reminder that Egypt's independence was no longer absolute. The sensory details of this environment were subtle. The distinct appearance of Roman attire among the crowd, the occasional sound of Latin spoken alongside Greek and Egyptian, the quiet awareness of a foreign influence woven into familiar surroundings. Cleopatra's approach to this situation required careful balance. She needed to maintain her authority while acknowledging Rome's role. This meant engaging with Roman interest without allowing them to fully define her decisions. Historically, this dynamic reflects the broader relationship between Rome and its allied territories. Influence was often exerted through alliances rather than direct control, creating a complex interplay between autonomy and dependence. Cleopatra's earlier experiences prepared her for this. Her understanding of language, culture, and power allowed her to navigate interactions with Roman figures effectively. There is a quiet tension in this arrangement. While cooperation provided stability, it also introduced limitations. Cleopatra's decisions were influenced not only by internal considerations, but by how they aligned with Roman expectations. The environment within the palace likely reflected this awareness. Advisors discussing strategies, messengers carrying information between regions, and Cleopatra herself considering the broader implications of her actions. Her ability to maintain this balance suggests a level of adaptability. She did not resist Rome directly, but neither did she relinquish control entirely. Instead, she operated within the space between influence and independence. This period highlights a key aspect of her reign. Power was not simply held, it was managed within a shifting context. Cleopatra's success depended on her ability to adjust to these changes without losing her position. And as Rome's influence continued to grow, the need for this balance became increasingly important, shaping the course of her decisions. But this balance, carefully maintained, was not destined to last. The stability Cleopatra had worked to achieve was disrupted by events beyond her immediate control. At this point, the assassination of Julius Caesar in Rome introduced a sudden and significant shift. News of his death would have travelled across the Mediterranean, arriving in Egypt with a sense of quiet urgency. The atmosphere in Alexandria during this moment would have been marked by uncertainty, conversations becoming more cautious, advisors reassessing their positions, the overall rhythm of the city subtly changing. The sensory details remain understated. The quiet delivery of news, the measured reactions of those who understood its significance, the stillness that often follows unexpected change. For Cleopatra, this event carried immediate implications. Caesar had been a central figure in her restoration to power, and his absence created a gap that needed to be addressed. Historically, Caesar's death led to a period of instability within Rome itself. Competing factions emerged, each seeking to define the future of the Republic. This uncertainty extended outward, affecting regions connected to Rome. Cleopatra's position, though still secure within Egypt, now required reassessment. The alliance she had relied upon no longer existed in the same form. New relationships would need to be established. There's a quiet shift here from stability to uncertainty. The structures that had supported her position were changing, and the path forward was no longer clearly defined. The environment within the palace likely reflected this transition. Advisors discussing potential outcomes, messengers arriving with updates, and Cleopatra herself considering how to respond. Her earlier experiences, her exile, her interactions with Caesar, her understanding of power would have informed her approach. She had navigated uncertainty before, and she would need to do so again. There is also an element of inevitability. In a world shaped by shifting alliances and competing ambitions, stability was often temporary. Cleopatra's challenge was to adapt to these changes without losing her position. The atmosphere remains calm, but with an underlying sense of anticipation. The future was uncertain, but it was not without possibility. And as Cleopatra considered her next steps, the sudden loss of stability became not just a challenge, but a turning point, one that would lead her toward the next phase of her story. At this point, as the uncertainty following Caesar's death began to settle into a new and unfamiliar shape, another figure gradually entered Cleopatra's world. Mark Antony, a powerful Roman leader and one of Caesar's former allies, emerged not as a sudden replacement, but as part of the shifting structure of Roman authority. What made this transition more complex was that Rome itself was no longer unified in direction. After Caesar's assassination, power was divided among several key figures, and Antony was one of them. His influence extended across large regions, and Egypt, with its wealth and strategic importance, naturally fell within his sphere of interest. The atmosphere surrounding his arrival was quieter than one might expect. There was no immediate sense of drama, but rather a gradual recognition that another relationship, one that would shape Cleopatra's future, was beginning to form. The setting of their early interactions would have been carefully arranged. Spaces within Alexandria, or later in the Eastern Mediterranean, were prepared with the same attention to detail that Cleopatra had always maintained. Soft lighting, controlled movement of attendants, and a calm environment designed for conversation rather than spectacle. The sensory tone remained steady. The distant sound of water against stone, the low murmur of voices, the subtle presence of guards maintaining order without interruption. These were not moments defined by urgency, but by awareness. Cleopatra approached Antony differently than she had approached Caesar, though the underlying principles remained similar. She understood the importance of alignment, of presenting herself not only as a ruler, but as someone capable of navigating complex political realities. Antony, in contrast to Caesar, carried a different presence. He was known for his charisma and his connection to military life, less restrained in demeanour, yet still deeply involved in the strategic concerns of Rome. This created a dynamic that was both familiar and distinct. Historically, their meeting in Tarsus is often described with elaborate detail, emphasizing presentation and atmosphere. Cleopatra's arrival by river, adorned with symbols of wealth and divinity, has been interpreted as both a display and a message. Yet beneath this presentation was a calculated effort to establish her position. There is a quiet intention in this. Cleopatra was not simply meeting Antony. She was shaping how he would perceive her. The balance between impression and substance remained central to her approach. Their conversations likely moved between practical matters and broader considerations. The stability of Egypt, the needs of Rome, and the possibilities for cooperation all played a role. Personal elements may have been present, but they existed alongside strategic concerns. What made this relationship particularly significant was its timing. Cleopatra, having already experienced both exile and restoration, understood the importance of maintaining influence. Antony's position within Rome offered both opportunity and risk. The atmosphere surrounding their interactions carried a sense of careful pacing. Nothing needed to be rushed. Decisions could unfold gradually, shaped by ongoing dialogue rather than immediate action. And as their connection developed, it became clear that this was not simply a continuation of Cleopatra's past alliances. It was the beginning of something new, shaped by different circumstances and expectations. In this quiet transition, Cleopatra once again adapted, aligning herself with a changing world while maintaining her own sense of control. And so, as the story of Cleopatra slowly settles into stillness, what remains is not just the image of a queen, but the quiet outline of a life shaped by constant adjustment. She was not simply the figure history turned her into, not just a symbol of beauty or a character in someone else's narrative. She was a ruler navigating a world that was already shifting beneath her feet, balancing alliances, managing perception, and making decisions in moments where certainty was rarely available. There is something quietly familiar in that, because despite the distance of time, her world was not entirely different from our own. The need to adapt, the pressure to appear composed, the effort to hold things together even when the outcome is unclear, these are not ancient experiences. They are human ones. And yet Cleopatra's story reminds us of something else as well, that even in uncertainty there can be intention, that even in a life shaped by forces beyond control, there can still be moments of clarity, of choice, of quiet resilience. Her legacy, though filtered through the voices of others, still carries that trace. A life not as dramatic as legend suggests, but perhaps more real because of it. Now, as we leave Alexandria behind, its quiet harbour, its distant echoes of conversation, its fading glow against the water, you can return to your own world, a little slower, a little quieter. The past settles gently, like the end of a long story that doesn't quite need a conclusion. And for now, just rest.